So the book we're using, I don't know if anybody got to the end of chapter 1, all 46 pages of it, but that's the longest chapter. The others will be shorter. But in this book, one of the things that James Kugel, he's an Orthodox Jew. He taught at Yale and at Harvard, specializes in Hebrew Bible. But I really liked at the end what he said about this book. He said, "There is no magic bullet at the end of this book that will make all of modern scholarship's disturbing conclusions simply disappear. The dilemma this book describes is very real. To say this, I know will not satisfy all readers. Indeed, I'm sure that quite a few will, after sampling a few pages, wish only to forget what they have read and throw the book across the room." So my hope as we go through this class is that we learn how to integrate different interpretations of the Bible, especially interpretations from your own past, because we all carry understandings of the Bible to this place. And so how does that change what we understand now? And what are the pieces that over time maybe you've let go of? And how do they speak to one another? Because there's underlying assumptions that we make when we interpret the Bible. And where do these assumptions come from? There's a long history of biblical interpretation. And he gets into where is that coming from too. Also, love that we explore how does that the interpretations impact our faith too. That it's not just the scriptures, just an academic, but also how does it just impact the way that we exist in the world as well. And I hope that we'll just create a deeper space for appreciation of the Bible and faith growth too. And so, and there might be times when you're like, I just want to throw this book across the room. And he says it would make him sad if we did that. But it also comes with a warning too, that as we go through this, there's a lot of things that are in traditional interpretation that he challenges in traditional interpretation, and that can sometimes cause a crisis of faith. And so if in the midst of class, you're like, I'm having a crisis of faith, don't just like throw it all out the window, like talk with me and we'll have a conversation about this. But this type of Bible study that we're doing, it's not the right Bible study if you're going through a really difficult time of grief and you just really need a solid ground, because what we're going to be doing in this Bible study is shaking some of the ground up a little bit to see where are the assumptions, because that's what allows us to see underneath and see those assumptions. But when we're going through times where we're extremely vulnerable, that's not the time to shake the ground. And so to be aware of that within yourself too. And there's also places where, as we look at different interpretations of stories, you might discover, this is a place where like I need solid ground, or I've never had this ground shaken before. So it might make you a little uncomfortable at certain times. But I hope a lot of it is that it just makes you really excited to get to understand your faith and the scriptures in a whole new way. So I hope it's a lot more of that, even though he warns us, you might want to throw this book across the room. Also, why? So this book, we're focusing on the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament as we go throughout this year. And so why focus on the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible as opposed to focusing on the New Testament as a Christian community? And the reason why some of our Bible studies focus more on the Old Testament for our evening ones is there's a lot in worship where we focus on the New Testament. And so I'm hoping that you're still studying the New Testament and you're just getting that through worship and through other things around the church, but a better understanding of the Old Testament will enhance understanding of the New Testament. Because there's a lot about the New Testament that is interpreting the Old Testament in places or pulling from that. Does that all sound good? Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah. Any questions or thoughts so far?
When I was reading the little intro and whatever, I can't remember how far I got, but I was surprised that he's an Orthodox Jewish person.
Yeah.
That was surprising because, traditionally they take the Bible a little more literally, or at least they follow it closely. So yeah.
Yeah.
Just surprised.
No, I read an article about James Kugel, and in the article, it was an Orthodox Jew that was writing the article, and he said that growing up, you would hear stories about like if you were ever accepted to go to school at Harvard, don't go because like it'll destroy your faith. And and if
there he
you
is.
do go, do not go to James Kugel's classes because you'll leave a heretic.
Yeah.
So and his book starts with
DC's around.
with a story of a heresy and in the Presbyterian church.
Yes.
And a lot of interpretation, when people interpret it, when they're ahead of their time in interpretation, sometimes it's called a heresy. And so we'll see as we look through that, some of the people that we're talking about for interpretations who have changed in modern biblical scholarship, when they first started talking about it, they were heretics because they didn't agree with what was the common accepted belief, even though we've moved more towards these other understandings. And now they wouldn't be heretics, but they were at the time. So
there still are heretics.
And there, yeah.
Yes.
Then could be celebrated too.
Yes. Yeah. All right.
So some key points just to get us on firm grounding, understanding Bible. So the Bible is literally means library. It's a library of books that you have. Parts date back probably to the 10th century BCE, maybe even earlier. Started as an oral tradition, then written down, copied and copied and copied. Interpretations are all a part of that. And then we've have translated into all different languages as well. And so that's kind of the literature side of it. Historically, we are located for biblical scholarship in the Mesopotamian Empire, or the Mesopotamian area, which was a series of empires starting back to the Sumer civilization. So Sumer civilization, this is the oldest known written language, comes out of that. Sumerian comes out of the Sumer civilization. After the fall of the Sumer civilization, or empires don't like cleanly exist and then stop to exist. There's a lot of overlap with that. But next, the Akkadians were there. They collapsed, not really sure why, probably drought, internal strife. And then you had the Babylonians, and that's the old Babylonian Empire. And you might be aware of like Hammurabi, why am I saying the Code of Hammurabi? Hammurabi. I don't know why I was having trouble putting the M's together tonight. But yeah. Then the Hittites were the next civilization, and then the Assyrians, and then the Neo-Babylonians. And the Neo-Babylonians, it places us in the place of one of the major pieces that caused a change in ancient interpretation, because we have the Babylonian exile that occurs during the period of the Neo-Babylonians, with Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to Jerusalem, to Judah in 587 BCE. And then there was the exportation of Jewish people to Babylon. This forced exile took place, it wasn't all at once. There was tens of thousands of people, but it took place in phases. So you started with like the highest ranking officials, because you try to break down the leadership first. And then you continue to kind of move people out. Not everyone left Judah. So there were people who stayed in Judah and were not exiled. And after the Persians rose to power and the Neo-Babylonian Empire fell, Cyrus the Great made a decree that everybody could return to Jerusalem. They could rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, which is why he's called Cyrus the Great. Not everyone decided to return. So you had some people who returned, some people who actually stayed in Judah the entire time, and some people who stayed in Babylon. And this created a lot of different understandings of what does it mean to be Jewish then? And what does it mean to recreate a culture after you've been exiled?
What was the timeline on
The
that?
timeline of that, so Babylonian captivity was from 586 BCE to
Okay.
538.
Okay.
So Cyrus the Great said they could go back 538.
So about 50 years.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So a whole generation.
Yeah.
So it wasn't the people who were first exiled who probably went back. It was the next generation who had heard about what Jerusalem and Judah was like before. And they were the ones who were then going back. It also meant you didn't take the leaders who were the same leaders, they were dead. So, like, you had to figure out new political powers, new political structure. Everything was shaken up, which really changed how people were looking at how do you interpret the Bible. Because rather than just reading the Bible as these stories and things, it became what do our ancient texts have to say to us about how we can rebuild? Like, what do they remind us about the past? And so, how do they speak into the present? And that was a really important piece of ancient biblical interpretation is how does it speak into the present moment? And another really important piece was that you would read the most favorable reading into it. So when you look at scripture, you'd assume the best of it. So if scripture says something and it seems like, this is just really crazy and it's off the wall, you assume the best and you try to figure out what's the best thing it's trying to tell me. How is it, like, what's it intending to say? I don't understand it right now, but maybe if I add a little bit to it, or like I read the words just a little different. Ancient Hebrew doesn't have punctuation in it, so maybe I don't have the sentence right. So I must not understand it if, like, it's not saying something helpful and favorable in this situation. Which led to some critiques by later saying, well, then ancient interpreters were just flipping over backwards. Like, how do you read the best out of this scripture? Maybe it's not always the best. But these interpretations were being passed down with scriptures. So these ancient interpretations, you'd have the scriptures, and then you'd have the interpretations, and they're being passed down together. And in many cases, having equal authority. So as Protestants, we have this concept of by scripture alone, solo scripture, which is like the Bible can speak for itself, and you can understand the Bible just by reading the Bible. But that's not always been the assumption. Ancient interpreters, with the interpretation, well, what did other people say? And that interpretation would help you understand as you read scriptures too. Which then morphed further into, once you had a church, then you had like church authorities were layering new interpretations on it. And then it became, it's these interpretations and the scriptures and the church authority. And it's only that can tell you what scriptures understand. Because as the early church moved further and into the Middle Ages, people weren't able to read the scriptures anymore. And so it was only the church that had the power to say what it meant. And that was the understanding of how you would interpret. Because you would just take what was being said before, and that was the interpretation period. You wouldn't question that. And there were some assumptions that were carried along with that. And Kugel names 4 of them. So 1, the Bible is fundamentally a cryptic text, is one assumption. What do you think for each of you? Like, what's your gut reaction to that? The Bible is fundamentally a cryptic text. That it has hidden meanings and you have to figure it out.
Exciting.
Exciting?
It's kind of daunting.
Daunting?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's one of the ancient assumptions that have been carried forward, and it's still a little bit, it's been questioned by modern biblical scholarship, but it still has you can still hear it in different places. 2, the Bible is a book of lessons is an ancient assumption. That you can still see a lot of places. Another ancient assumption is there are no contradictions.
Sometimes you have to stretch a
I
little
was gonna
bit to
say,
get
I
around
know.
that.
These are ancient assumptions. We're gonna
Yes.
get to all of these assumptions are also turned on their head later. Okay. Another ancient assumption that it's divinely given. And that ancient assumption is not understood the same way in all ancient like understandings. So those are the 4. Then what happens is like built on these assumptions, there starts to be reading the Bible literally, reading the Bible allegorically, reading it like morally to get what's it say to my individual soul out of, and then also reading the Bible mystically to understand end times or the fullness of time. So you'd have the face value, you'd have allegory, which came from the Greek influence in reading the Bible, and then an individual moral and continued from that. So those assumptions, like it's been built on, you've got these layers and layers of interpretation that are happening, and these 4-fold interpretation is built on those original assumptions. And then we have the Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance, and the Protestant Reformation, and everything gets questioned. It's like just everything. They're starting to question the authority of the previous interpreters. Well, if you started questioning the authority of the previous interpreters, well, when do you stop questioning the interpretations then? Do you stop just with the last decade? Do you stop with the last century? Do you stop with the last couple thousand years? Which interpreters
Yeah, really.
do you stop
You
with?
just go all the way back to the writers,
Yeah. So
question them.
then you go all the way back to the writers.
Hmm.
And then the question becomes, well, which writers?
Yeah.
Who wrote them? And then there became a question, was it really written by the people who we say have historically said wrote these books? And that was brought into
How did
question.
they get into the Bible?
And
That one always fascinates me because
How did
Apocrypha.
these particular books get into the Bible?
Hmm.
And there was also a move away from allegory as well, of saying, you know, the Bible has hidden meanings, to what if the Bible just is saying what it means? Like, what if there's some things that just are straightforward and it's just saying that?
Maybe part of it is.
Yeah. Yep. And then there's also, as like continued questioning, maybe it shouldn't all be read exactly the same. Maybe we should read parts of the Bible as allegory, parts of it are pretty straightforward. Like one part I think is pretty straightforward is love the Lord your God and love your neighbor. Like I think that's pretty straightforward. I don't think it's an allegory for anything. And then there's also the questioning of, well, if we're pulling away all these interpreters, and then that pulls away the authority of the church, what are we going to be left with? And these biblical scholars and church leaders, they're like, it's going to be mass chaos. Everyone's going to be interpreting the Bible in all different ways, and it's going to be awful because nobody's going to know what anybody, like, we're not going to be able to talk the same. We're all going to be divided. And so then that led to trained biblical scholarship. And that's why you still see like some, like Germany is known as a large area of biblical scholarship. And some of these European countries, also the US and Canada, had a rise of biblical scholarship, of that you would pair the intellect with the spiritual reading of it too. So that it wasn't just a whatever I feel is what I get out of scripture, but kind of a pairing of those things. So that's.
Oh, I was just gonna say, when you said the first thing, the chaos, I feel like that's kind of what's happened though. Hello, Christian nationalism. I mean, people read the same passage of the Bible and get radically different things out of it. So I think there's been kind of a backlash against the historical studies of it.
Yeah.
People don't care about the historical part of it.
Yeah.
Some people. But that's
Yeah.
interesting that, yeah, that kind of happened.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure there was a lot of just during the Reformation, all the interpretations you
Yeah.
got right away.
Yeah.
Some of that was probably similar to Christian nationalism.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah. Can use
Yeah. And in the Enlightenment,
using the Bible.
that goes back to the Enlightenment too, because then there became a distrust just in
Yeah.
interpretation and even in scripture itself, which is what led to deism during that time period. So Benjamin Franklin was a deist,
That's right.
or founding fathers were deists, and a number of them were. And so it was a questioning of, do scriptures, are they even right? Is even a question? Do they even have things to say? Is God not, like, God's deism believes maybe there's a creator, but God is not active in the world in deism. And so that, and then I think Christian nationalism has been a backlash to some of that
Right.
as well.
I guess the flip side of it is this lasted though through all of that. People are still reading the Bible, so
I know.
it's
Yeah,
it's
hasn't-
endured through all that. So through every
Right.
slam and weird interpretation.
I don't know. So that was an overview of chapter 1 in here. And he writes it much better. There's a lot more examples, and then I can explain it. But I wanted to give that because it really is a grounding, even if you don't read that first chapter, for the rest of our discussions with each other.
I feel like he has some humor, which is nice.
He does.
It's kind of.
He does have
Funny.
humor. I giggled during.
I mean, you
some of
can't take it too seriously, otherwise you go crazy. So, yeah, so he has a good approach.
Yes. So I'd like us to get into just what are some of our thoughts on what we believe about the Bible. So I'm going to pause the recording here, and the rest of it we'll just kind of talk through it.